The moment Rowan Atkinson stepped onto the Loose Women stage, there was an immediate shift in the air, not dramatic enough for viewers at home to notice, but unmistakable to those sitting in the studio. He carried himself with the quiet politeness he was famous for, yet beneath it was a tension that even the makeup team had whispered about moments before the cameras rolled. The hosts greeted him with their usual enthusiasm, expecting a charming conversation sprinkled with witty anecdotes. But today, Rowan wasn't here to entertain with slapstick memories or comedic nostalgia. There was a seriousness in his eyes that hinted the show was about to veer in a direction no one had prepared for. The interview began smoothly. They talked briefly about his legacy, his iconic career, and a recent charity project. Everything was calm until Denise Welch, who had been watching him closely, shifted the energy with a pointed question. She asked him about his recent public comments regarding freedom of expression in comedy, a topic he had opened up about before, but rarely in a live, unscripted environment like this. The question wasn't harsh, but it carried an unmistakable challenge. Rowan paused, adjusted his posture, and delivered a thoughtful explanation about how comedians were now navigating a landscape filled with social scrutiny and intense public reaction. Denise listened, but her expression hardened. She leaned forward, countering his point with her belief that society wasn't restricting comedians, it was simply evolving, and comedy needed to evolve with it. Rowan raised an eyebrow, visibly unmoved by the argument. He insisted that comedians should be allowed to push boundaries without the constant fear of backlash. His tone was calm, yet firm enough to suggest this wasn't a topic he was willing to compromise on. The conversation, once controlled, began heating up. The other panelists exchanged uneasy glances, subtly attempting to redirect the tone with lighter questions, but Denise wasn't ready to step back. She pressed him again, suggesting that his perspective came from a place of privilege, that he had enjoyed decades of success without facing the scrutiny younger comedians now deal with. This remark hit Rowan harder than expected. He exhaled slowly, and the audience sensed a shift. He clarified that his concerns had nothing to do with age or status, but with the fundamental nature of comedy itself. Denise shook her head, interrupting him, and the two began talking over each other. What had started as a polite disagreement had now turned into a philosophical battle. Rowan, usually reserved and measured, grew increasingly straightforward, even blunt. Denise, fueled by conviction, pushed back just as strongly. The studio audience fell silent, captivated by a tension that didn't feel scripted or performative, it felt real. The hosts tried to interrupt with jokes, or to steer the discussion somewhere safer, but by then the clash had its own momentum. Rowan's voice remained even, but the irritation beneath it was visible. He spoke about how comedy had always thrived in discomfort, how it held a mirror to society, and how stripping it of risk stripped it of meaning. Denise accused him of protecting outdated ideas. The words between them grew tighter, sharper. And then came the moment everyone would replay online. Rowan removed his earpiece. It was a small action, silent, but devastating in its implication. The other hosts called his name, startled. Denise froze, seemingly unsure how to respond. Rowan looked at the audience, not at the panel, and apologized for the atmosphere the interview had taken. In a gesture both polite and deeply final, he stood up. The studio erupted in confusion as he walked toward the backstage exit. Producers rushed forward, the camera operators scrambled to adjust, and Denise tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Without a backward glance, Rowan left the set just seconds before the show abruptly cut to commercial. What remained was a stunned silence, both in the studio and, soon, across millions of screens. From the moment the cameras returned from the opening segment, something about Rowan Atkinson's presence suggested a different kind of interview was unfolding, one that would be remembered long after the episode ended. He sat with his hands folded, his posture impeccably polite, yet his expression carried that unmistakable hint of introspection he often wore when discussing serious matters. The hosts eased into the conversation with cheerful familiarity, praising his long career and asking playful questions about iconic roles. Rowan, gracious as ever, responded with soft smiles and brief anecdotes, though even these felt more restrained than usual. Then Denise Welch entered the discussion with a shift in tone that was subtle, but decisive. She brought up Rowan's previous comments on freedom of speech, particularly his belief that comedians were facing more constraints than ever before. Her phrasing wasn't hostile, yet it carried the edge of someone determined to ignite a deeper debate. Rowan, prepared for the topic, responded with measured clarity. He emphasized that comedy was not merely entertainment but a vital part of cultural dialogue, one that required space to explore uncomfortable truths. His voice was calm, his words chosen with care, but the conviction behind them was unmistakable. Denise, however, wasn't satisfied with the nuance. She leaned in, her body language signaling challenge. She argued that society wasn't restricting comedy but redefining what was acceptable as people grew more aware of harmful stereotypes and outdated humor. She insisted that comedians needed to evolve rather than resist. Rowan listened with his characteristic stillness, but when he responded, there was a firmness in his tone that hadn't been present earlier. He disagreed, not angrily, but with a quiet passion that made the studio lean forward. The tension began to simmer. Denise countered by suggesting that his viewpoint came from a place of generational distance, that he hadn't grown up in the hyper-connected, hypercritical environment newer comedians faced. Rowan raised his eyebrows slightly, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. He replied that creativity shouldn't be governed by fear of backlash, and that the essence of comedy had always involved risk. His voice remained level, but a faint intensity vibrated beneath each word. The hosts attempted to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, but the current was too strong. Denise pressed again, this time with even more force. She accused certain older comedians of clinging to outdated freedoms without acknowledging societal growth. Rowan didn't flinch. Instead, he countered with a pointed remark about the dangers of policing humor and mistaking sensitivity for moral superiority. The audience reacted with a low murmur, sensing the thin line they were now walking. Denise bristled, interrupting him mid-sentence. Rowan stopped speaking and simply looked at her, not angrily, but with a kind of clarified disappointment. He waited until she finished, then tried to continue, but she cut in once more. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted sharply. Rowan's expression tightened. He wasn't someone known for dramatic displays, but the interruption seemed to push the conversation past a threshold. He removed his earpiece. The gesture froze the room. The other hosts blinked, startled. The producers panicked behind the cameras. Denise opened her mouth as if to backtrack, but the moment had already crystallized. Rowan stood up slowly, his composure absolute. He apologized, not to the panel, but to the audience, saying that the discussion had drifted into hostility rather than dialogue. His tone was controlled, polite, but it carried the unmistakable finality of a man who had made his decision. He turned and began walking toward the exit. The hosts called after him, their voices overlapping with frantic urgency. A floor manager rushed forward, gesturing in hopes of coaxing him back, but Rowan didn't break stride. Denise attempted to speak, but her voice cracked, the weight of the moment striking her too late. Just before Rowan disappeared backstage, a stray comment from her, barely audible, slipped out, something defensive and unintended. He paused for half a second, then continued walking without looking back. The show cut abruptly to commercial. When the cameras returned, the atmosphere was thick with shock. The hosts tried to regain their composure, but the tension clung to the air like static. Online, the clip began spreading within minutes, sparking debates, memes, and think pieces. Supporters praised Rowan's stance, critics defended Denise's perspective. Yet across all sides, one thing was universally agreed upon. Loose women had just witnessed a moment no one expected, and nothing would quite be the same afterward. The interview with Rowan Atkinson on Loose Women began with the polished smoothness expected of a daytime talk show, yet underneath the friendly chatter there was an undeniable spark of tension, subtle at first, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. Rowan, dressed neatly and speaking with his usual understated charm, responded politely to the panel's early questions about his legacy and recent projects. The audience adored him, and the hosts seemed eager to keep the segment warm, light, and entertaining. But from the moment Denise Welch shifted in her seat, glancing at her notes with a particular sharpness, the tone began its slow, inevitable transformation. She leaned forward, her voice steady but deliberately pressing, and asked Rowan about his comments on the shrinking boundaries of comedy. Her phrasing hinted at confrontation, curiosity on the surface, challenge underneath. Rowan's eyes narrowed just slightly, as though bracing himself. He launched into a thoughtful explanation of why he believed comedians were increasingly afraid to take risks, arguing that comedy's power lay precisely in its ability to provoke, unsettle, and spark debate. His words were articulate and measured, but firm enough to show he stood by what he said. Denise responded with a quick, sharp counterpoint, arguing that society's heightened awareness wasn't censorship but progress, that jokes carrying outdated or harmful stereotypes shouldn't be protected under the banner of freedom. Rowan didn't interrupt, but his posture stiffened. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. It was still calm, still controlled, but less about gentle conversation and more about drawing a clear line in the sand. He insisted that the essence of comedy had always challenged norms and that sanitizing humor undermined its entire purpose. What followed was an exchange that gained intensity with every back and forth. Denise pressed her point with growing force, suggesting that older comedians struggled with modern expectations. Rowan's mouth tightened in a restrained expression of disapproval. He countered that comedians weren't opposed to change, they simply needed the freedom to experiment without fearing immediate outrage. His words carried a quiet passion that surprised even the viewers who had never seen him speak this directly. The other panelists, sensing where this could go, attempted to lighten the mood with small jokes or quick subject shifts, but neither Rowan nor Denise took the bait. Their debate became its own entity on the stage, pulling attention like a magnetic field. Denise's tone sharpened. Rowan's replies grew more pointed. Neither raised their voice, but the quiet intensity between them felt louder than shouting. Then came the moment that changed everything. Denise interrupted him again, this time before he had even completed a thought. Rowan stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed wasn't the natural pause of conversation, it was a halt, cold and complete. He looked at her for a beat too long, not angrily, but with a depth of disappointment that seemed to ripple through the room. The host shifted uncomfortably. A camera operator hesitated, unsure whether to zoom in or cut away. Rowan slowly reached up, and with a small, deliberate motion, removed his earpiece. The studio froze. The audience murmured, sensing the gravity of the gesture. Denise's confidence faltered for the first time, she leaned back as though trying to gather her words. Rowan spoke softly, apologizing to the viewers for the atmosphere and saying that he preferred not to continue a conversation that had become more combative than constructive. His politeness made the moment even more dramatic. He was not storming off in anger, but stepping away with dignity. He stood up. The hosts attempted to intervene, their voices layered with urgency, but Rowan was already walking toward the edge of the set. A producer appeared at the side, signaling frantically, perhaps hoping to salvage the segment, but Rowan didn't break stride. Just before he disappeared behind the curtain, Denise muttered something under her breath, an instinctive, defensive remark she likely didn't intend for him to hear. Rowan stopped for the briefest moment, his shoulders tightening, then continued walking without turning around. The screen abruptly cut to a commercial break. When the show returned, the energy had completely collapsed. The panel sat stiffly, trying to laugh off the moment, but the tension lingered like an echo. Viewers online replayed the clip again and again, dissecting every word, every expression, every second of silence. Some sided with Rowan, others with Denise, but everyone agreed on one thing. They had just witnessed one of the most unforgettable, unscripted clashes in the show's history.